This boy is Eric Smith, and he is only 13 years old. But why is he sitting in court? Why is he waiting for the court's verdict? So what crime did he commit at an age when he should be in school? Let's find out. The sky over Savona on August 2nd, 1993, was eerily clear. A perfect summer day in the small town nestled among the lush green hills of Steuben County in western New York. In the thick summer air, the buzz of cicadas mixed with the laughter of children on summer break. For the residents of this tiny town of just over 800 people, it was a community where everyone knew each other, where doors were rarely locked, and where children still played freely on the streets without constant adult supervision. Derrick Robie stood on the porch, watching her little son, 4-year-old Derrick, prepare for his very first small adventure. The boy wore his favorite Pokemon t-shirt, blue shorts, and tiny sneakers with red laces. Derrick's golden hair shimmered in the morning sun, and his big bright blue eyes sparkled with the pure excitement of childhood as he asked to walk alone to the summer play program. Doreen felt a moment of hesitation. The summer program Derrick attended was only about a quarter-mile away, a short walk along the peaceful streets of Savona. She had always accompanied him before, but today, under the clear sky and with the thrill evident on his face, she decided perhaps it was time to allow Derrick a bit of independence. She agreed, but reminded him to walk straight there and not to stop to talk to anyone. Derrick nodded seriously, his big eyes shining with pride at being trusted with this important mission. He gave his mother a tight hug, his tiny arms wrapped around Doreen's neck, and said, "I love you," before turning away to begin his short journey, his lunch bag swinging at his side. Doreen stood on the porch, watching her little boy walk down the street, his small figure gradually disappearing around the corner. She could not have known that this would be the last time she ever saw her son alive, that the simple decision to let Derrick walk alone on this fateful day would become one she would regret for the rest of her life. Just a few hours later, when Derrick didn't show up at the summer program and didn't return home for lunch, panic began to grip Doreen's heart. Her maternal instinct told her something was terribly wrong. After contacting the program and confirming that Derrick had never arrived, she immediately called the police. Within an hour, the entire Savona community had mobilized to search, with dozens of neighbors and friends forming groups to comb through every corner of the small town, calling Derrick's name with increasing desperation. At around 4:30 p.m., one of the search groups discovered something they would never be able to erase from their memories, a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a small wooded area near Stanley Park, only about 100 meters from Derrick's usual path, the boy's small body was found among the trees, hastily covered with leaves and branches. He had been brutally beaten, strangled with his own shoelaces, and subjected to unspeakable abuse. As news of Derrick's death spread, a wave of collective horror swept over Savona. Parents kept their children indoors. Doors that had once been left open were now locked tight, and the fear that a killer was hiding among them spread like wildfire. In the days following the murder, conspiracy theories and rumors ran rampant in the small town. People suspected strangers, travelers, or the usual suspects with prior records of sexual offenses. No one could have imagined that the truth would be more horrifying than any rumor they could have come up with. Eric M. Smith was not a stranger to the Savona community. Born into a typical family, he stood out as a child with fiery red hair, thick glasses, and a freckled face. At 13 years old, Eric was often the target of cruel bullying by his peers due to his unusual appearance. Taunts like "firehead" and "freckleface" followed him through school hallways and on playgrounds. Ted and Tammy Smith, Eric's parents, had long realized their son was different. From a young age, Eric displayed troubling behaviors, from self-harm to cruelty toward animals, from violent outbursts to an alarming indifference to the pain of others. They repeatedly sought professional help, taking Eric to a series of psychologists and specialists who diagnosed him with intermittent explosive disorder, a rare condition that makes it difficult for a person to control impulsive rage and aggression. Despite these early warning signs, no one could have predicted that Eric Smith, a 7th grader at the local middle school, would go on to commit one of the most shocking crimes in modern American history. On the fateful morning of August 2nd, 1993, Eric was riding his bike to his own summer program when he saw Derrick Robie walking alone. According to Eric's later confession, he felt a sudden impulse, an uncontrollable urge to approach the younger boy. Eric called out to Derrick in a friendly, non-threatening voice. Derrick, with the innocent trust typical of childhood, stopped and explained he was headed to the summer program. Eric, much older and in a position of power, offered to show the boy a shortcut. Without suspicion, Derrick followed Eric into the nearby woods, an innocent decision that would cost him his life. What happened next was recounted by Eric with chilling detachment during a later police interrogation. Once inside this secluded part of the woods, Eric launched a brutal attack. He struck Derrick with large rocks, strangled him with his own shoelaces, and committed other vile acts against the boy's body. Then, in a half-hearted attempt to conceal his crime, Eric covered Derrick's body with leaves and branches before continuing on to his summer program, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The early days of the investigation left the police baffled. There were no witnesses to the abduction, no clear physical evidence at the scene, and no obvious suspects. However, as investigators began interviewing local children who had attended summer programs in the area, a pattern began to emerge. Several children reported seeing a red-haired boy with glasses riding a bicycle near Derrick Robie's route on that fateful morning. When Eric Smith was brought in for questioning, initially just as a potential witness, he displayed an unusually calm demeanor. As investigators dug deeper, they began to notice inconsistencies in Eric's story. Details changed, timelines didn't add up, and gradually, a disturbing picture began to form. On August 5, 1993, just 3 days after Derrick's death, Eric Smith was brought into an interrogation room alongside his mother. After hours of questioning, the unthinkable happened. A 13-year-old boy coldly confessed to killing Derrick Robie. When investigators asked about the motive, unable to comprehend why a child would kill another child, Eric's answer shook the very foundations of society's understanding of childhood criminal behavior. "I just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone." The confession sent shockwaves across the country. National media quickly descended on Savona, turning the story of the red-haired boy and his 4-year-old victim into the epicenter of a nationwide debate on childhood violence, mental illness, and the failures of the mental health support system. Images of Eric Smith, with his bright red hair, thick glasses, and emotionless expression, became the symbol of a particularly terrifying kind of criminal, the child killer. Eric Smith's trial began in August 1994, exactly 1 year after Derrick Robie's death. The courtroom at the Steuben County Courthouse in Bath, New York, was packed with reporters, documentary filmmakers, and grieving community members. Outside, a large crowd gathered, some holding signs demanding justice for Derrick, while others called for mercy for Eric. A complex response to a complex case. Inside the stifling courtroom, Eric Smith sat beside his defense attorney, Ted Sly. Although 14 years old by then, Eric still had the appearance of a much younger child, short, skinny, with thick glasses that enhanced his boyish look. In stark contrast to this childlike image was the brutal nature of the crime he was accused of, a contradiction that bewildered the jury and captivated the public. The central issue in the trial was not whether Eric had killed Derrick. He had already confessed, but whether he could be held fully responsible for his actions. Attorney Sly mounted an insanity defense, arguing that Eric suffered from not one, but two mental conditions that rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. First, Sly introduced the theory that Eric had ZUI syndrome, a rare chromosomal abnormality that some studies have linked to aggressive and violent behavior. Genetic evidence was presented, with experts testifying that Eric had an abnormal chromosome pattern that may have affected his impulse control. Second, the defense focused on the more definitive diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder, IED, a condition that made Eric prone to uncontrollable violent outbursts, often triggered by minor provocations. Eric Smith's brain does not function like that of a normal 13-year-old, Sly argued in his emotional opening statement. He is governed by impulses he cannot control. If a person cannot control their actions, How can we punish them as if they could? Prosecutor John Tunney, on the other hand, painted the picture of a calculated killer, emphasizing that Eric had planned the crime, lured the victim to a secluded area, and made efforts to conceal the offense. This was not an impulsive act, Tunney argued. This was a deliberate act, carried out with clear awareness of the consequences. Eric Smith knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway. The trial became a battlefield of psychologists and psychiatrists, each offering opposing views on Eric's mental state and capacity for responsibility. While some experts claimed Eric lacked fundamental empathy and could not grasp the wrongfulness of his actions, others argued he was fully aware and acted with clear intent. One of the most striking moments of the trial came when psychiatrists recounted their interviews with Eric. The 13-year-old described the murder with chilling detachment, recounting the brutal details of his actions without any obvious signs of remorse or sorrow. When asked how he felt watching Derrick suffer, Eric reportedly replied, "I didn't feel anything." Sitting in the courtroom, listening to the horrifying accounts of what had happened to their son, Dale and Derrick Robie endured an indescribable nightmare. With each gruesome detail revealed, their pain deepened. And yet, throughout the trial, they maintained an astonishing dignity, determined to ensure that justice would be served for their son. After 2 weeks of testimony and argument, the jury retired to deliberate. The question before them was not merely about the guilt of one child, but about the broader issue of how we define responsibility, crime, and justice when the lines between mental illness and criminal behavior blur. After less than 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Eric Smith was guilty of second-degree murder. The jury rejected the defense's claim that Eric could not be held accountable due to mental illness, concluding that regardless of any underlying psychological issues, he understood the wrongful nature of his actions. When the verdict was read, Eric maintained the expressionless face that had become his signature throughout the trial. Behind him, his parents, Ted and Tammy Smith, sat in pained silence, grappling with the harsh reality that their son, at just 13 years old, had become a convicted murderer. The sentencing phase posed a difficult question. How do you punish a child who has committed such a horrific crime? Under New York law at the time, Eric faced a sentence ranging from 9 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 years. Before sentencing, Eric was given the chance to speak. For the first time, the seemingly impenetrable shell around him began to crack. In a soft, trembling voice, Eric said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I don't know why I did it." But for the Robie family, the apology came far too late. They spoke emotionally about the immeasurable impact of their son's death. Derrick was a special child with a smile that could light up a room, Derrick Robie said, her voice choked with emotion. His future was stolen, and we were robbed of our little boy. No punishment is enough for this crime. Judge Donald Wisner, clearly affected by the brutality of the crime and what he perceived as Eric's lack of remorse, handed down the harshest sentence possible, 9 years to life, with the first chance of parole after 9 years. "The court cannot comprehend the defendant's actions," Judge Wisner stated, "but the court can and will ensure that the defendant never has the opportunity to harm another innocent child." With that sentence, Eric Smith, only 14 years old, became one of the youngest individuals in modern U.S. history to be sentenced to life in prison. As he was led out of the courtroom, both the Smith and Robie families remained in painful silence. Forever bound by a tragedy none of them could truly understand. For most 13-year-olds, the following years would be filled with middle school, exploring hobbies, first crushes, learning to drive, and graduation. For Eric Smith, those years were marked by prison walls, rigid routines, and relative obscurity as the American public slowly forgot the red-headed boy who once shook the nation. Eric began his sentence at a juvenile facility where he continued his education and began receiving intensive psychological counseling. When he turned 21, he was transferred to an adult prison, a much harsher environment, where his identity as a child killer made him a potential target for other inmates. As Eric Smith grew from a teenager into an adult, his life in prison remained relatively quiet. Those who interacted with Eric during these years described a remarkable transformation. The red-headed boy who committed a horrifying crime gradually became a quiet man focused on learning and self-improvement. Throughout his incarceration, Eric participated in numerous educational programs, eventually earning a college degree through correspondence courses. He also took part in counseling and therapy sessions, working with psychologists to understand the deeper reasons behind the horrifying act he committed as a child. The Eric of today is not the Eric of 1993, one prison staff member said in a rare interview. He's spent thousands of hours reflecting on his crime, trying to understand why he did it, and finding a way to live a meaningful life even behind bars. In 2002, when Eric became eligible for parole for the first time, the Robie family faced the painful reality that the person who killed their son might be released. They launched a vigorous campaign to keep Eric in prison, writing heartfelt letters to the parole board and attending every hearing to ensure Derrick's voice was not forgotten. "We are never allowed to heal," Derrick Robie said at the first parole hearing. "Every 2 years we have to come back here, reopen the wounds, and relive the horrific details of how our son died. How can we move on without real closure?" The Robie family's emotional statements, combined with the brutality of the crime and concerns about Eric's potential to reoffend, led to the denial of his first parole request, then the second, and the third. Over the course of 10 parole attempts, the board denied Eric each time, citing various reasons, from the severity of the crime to his lack of understanding of his own motive. With each denial, Eric returned to prison to wait another 2 years, while the Robie family experienced a brief moment of relief. But every 2 years, the fear would rise again as a new hearing approached, forcing them to relive the nightmare of losing their son. Meanwhile, the town of Savona had changed. The collective innocence that existed before 1993 never fully returned. Parents became more vigilant, rarely allowing their children to walk alone, even in safe neighborhoods. And although time had softened some wounds, the case of Eric Smith and Derrick Robie remained a permanent part of the community's memory. To honor Derrick, the community built the Derrick Robie Memorial Field, a space where children could play safely under careful adult supervision. At the center stood a small statue of a child holding a soccer ball, with a simple plaque, "In memory of Derrick Robie, 1989, 1993, forever in our hearts." Every year, on August 2, the day Derrick was killed, the community held a memorial service, lighting candles and releasing balloons into the sky. For the Robie family, the years after Derrick's death brought unimaginable challenges. Dale and Doreen struggled not only with the grief of losing their son, but also with constant media attention, unanswerable questions about why this had happened, and the exhausting burden of fighting to keep Eric Smith behind bars. "Every morning I wake up, I still expect to hear Derrick's little footsteps running down the hallway," Doreen shared in a rare interview. "There are still days I find myself making breakfast for 3 instead of 2. The pain never truly goes away. You just learn how to live with it." Meanwhile, the Smith family also faced their own challenges. As the parents of the monster child, as many newspapers labeled Eric, they endured social isolation, threats, and the heavy burden of guilt and self-doubt. They questioned whether they could have done something differently to prevent the tragedy. They wondered if they had missed any warning signs that could have alerted them to what was coming. Even so, Ted and Tammy Smith remained loyal to their son, visiting Eric regularly in prison and supporting his efforts for parole. They believed that their son had changed, that the boy who had committed that brutal act no longer existed, and that the man Eric had become deserved a second chance. For Eric Smith, the years in prison brought significant challenges as well. He faced not only the isolation and restrictions of incarceration, but also the weight of the crime he had committed. In parole hearings, Eric consistently expressed deep remorse for his action. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about Derrick Robie and what I did," Eric said at one hearing. "I can't change the past, but I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to understand why I did it and to become a better person. Someone who would never hurt anyone again." However, for many, especially the Robie family, No amount of apology or remorse could ever be enough. How could there ever be enough repentance for an act that took the life of a 4-year-old child? How could there be forgiveness for such a brutal crime? In 2021, after 10 previous denials, the unthinkable happened. Eric Smith's 11th request for parole was granted. The news stunned the community of Savona and, most of all, the Robie family, who had fought tirelessly to keep Eric behind bars. "I feel like we've betrayed Derrick," Dale Robie said, his voice heavy with pain and disappointment. "How can they let the person who did this go free? How can they be sure he won't harm another child?" The decision to grant Eric parole was based on several factors. The parole board reviewed his exemplary behavior in prison, his participation in education and counseling programs, and psychological evaluation suggesting his risk of reoffending was low. They also considered his age at the time of the crime and the possibility that he had truly been rehabilitated after nearly 3 decades in prison. Yet for many, the decision remained controversial. How can anyone be certain that someone who once committed such an extreme act of violence will not do so again? How can one measure true remorse or genuine rehabilitation? On February 1st, 2022, after 28 years behind bars, Eric Smith, now a 42-year-old man, was released from the Woodbourne Correctional Facility in New York. He stepped into a world vastly different from the one he had left in 1994. The internet had transformed communication. Smartphones had become essential to daily life. And a global pandemic had fundamentally altered how society functioned. As part of his parole conditions, Eric had to comply with strict rules. He was required to report regularly to a parole officer, was prohibited from contacting anyone under the age of 18, and was banned from returning to Steuben County, the site of the crime. He also had to wear a GPS monitoring device and continue attending counseling sessions. The exact location of Eric Smith's post-release residence was kept confidential to protect both him and the public. However, reports indicated that he had relocated to another part of New York, where he hoped to start his life over in relative anonymity. Still, for some, including legal and psychological experts, Eric Smith's release represented an important principle of the justice system: the belief in rehabilitation. They argued that Eric had paid for his crime with nearly 3 decades of incarceration, and that the goal of the justice system is not only to punish, but also to restore. The question isn't whether Eric Smith deserves to be free, one criminologist explained. The question is whether we should fear him. And after 28 years of rehabilitation, with all the evidence suggesting has changed, the answer seems to be no. The case of Eric Smith and Derrick Robie left a profound and complex legacy, affecting not only those directly involved, but society as a whole. For the legal community, the case raised significant questions about how we treat juvenile offenders, especially those who commit violent crimes. It contributed to the ongoing debate about whether children can be held fully accountable in the same way as adults, and whether the focus of the juvenile justice system should be punishment or rehabilitation. More than 3 decades after the tragedy in Savona, New York, the story of Eric Smith and Derrick Robie still forces us to reflect deeply. It compels us to face the darkest corners of human behavior and the hardest questions about how we, as a society, respond to violence, loss, and the possibility of redemption. It is a story with no happy ending, no neat closure. Instead, it is a story of pain and loss, of remorse and consequence, and of the never-ending journey to find understanding in a world where such things can happen. And perhaps, in the end, that is the true legacy of this case. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, we must keep searching for the light of understanding, compassion, and the hope that by confronting the hardest truths about human nature, we might build a world where tragedies like this are less likely to happen